Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our NetApp and Microsoft webinar. Today we're joined by Simon Brown from NetApp and Matt Compton here from Byte Software Services.
Thanks, Sarah. So as Sarah said, my name is Matt Compton and I look after the storage business here at Byte. So my team are an overlay to the account managers, and with Microsoft being a key part of all our customers' infrastructure, it makes sense that we work closely with our vendors that complement them. One of these key vendor relationships is with NetApp, and we currently are a gold partner. What does that mean? It means that we hold all the relevant technical, product and sales accreditations to make sure that we're providing the best possible service whilst maintaining an extremely competitive price. We have in-house both technical consultants and a team of product specialists behind me, as well as over half of the account managers at Bytes having sat through some form of NetApp accreditation. So post this call, if you do require any scoping of infrastructure, ROI assistance, designs or health checks, then please request that, and obviously I'll be happy to help. So that's me. I'm now going to hand over to Simon Brown from NetApp, who is going to tell you the more exciting stuff. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so as I said, we'll touch on several different aspects of both our kind of corporate relationship and, more importantly, the technological innovations and integration that we have with Microsoft. But let's kind of set the scene a little bit first. We typically, in our day-to-day conversations with our customers and our prospects, hear some pretty consistent and recurrent themes. The challenge of how do you contain rising storage costs. It's not just rising because stuff's more expensive. It's rising because we have a requirement to store more. How do I then reduce the complexity of that environment and use the resources that I already have a bit more efficiently? So how can I deploy software applications to make better use of the hardware that I've already spent an awful lot of money on? And crucially, how do I respond to the changing needs of my business as an IT shop? And actually, what does that look like in practice? If we think of some of the experiences that we see on a day-to-day basis with regard to products and services from people like Dropbox or Amazon Web Services, we're finding that people are, whether they be IT employees or actually users within the company themselves, moving outside organizations to provision capability that they just can't get quickly enough in-house. We run with our partners and at NetApp probably 3-4 times a quarter, and we'll talk to you about one of these towards the end of the session today. Cafe briefings, which are kind of workshop environments for our customers and prospects to come to, that we get to dig into the technology in a little bit more detail. And I remember one around September time, just before Christmas, where we had the IT manager for a small legal firm from Leeds arrive, and that statement about people moving outside of IT, he kind of contested and said, well, we don't have that problem. Specifically with things like Dropbox, we absolutely don't have that problem. And when we asked him why and how they manage that, he said, well, it's just mandated. We have 200 employees, 115 of those are fee accruing lawyers, and it's a mandated part of their contract that they cannot host or store data outside of the business. So we said, well, can you check it? Well, yeah, I could do. And a couple of days later, he came back and asked for some help because of the 115 odd lawyers that they've got on their books. 93 were hosting very sensitive information outside of the business on Dropbox. And he very quickly kind of said, well, I think you've got a point. Helping me get a bit more control of my environment is pretty important. How do we do that? So it's not necessarily just about the way that we store and protect data. It's kind of, that's what we've grown up as a company, the way that we increase the amount of information you can store in a single footprint, how you then share and collaborate or move that data around for collaboration, how you store it very quickly after an outage. But crucially, how you manage it and how you scale that into the cloud is particularly relevant. And those, from a virtualization and cloud perspective, are the elements that we'll spend most of the time talking about today. So when we look at Microsoft-specific environments and Windows Server in particular, what do we see? Well, some of the challenges from a cost perspective around inefficient data deduplication and the amount of power and people and servers and storage you require with multiple silos across multiple applications, how expensive and the time it takes to deploy those systems and applications, especially for things like test and development. And we'll talk about a case study in 10 minutes or so's time just to talk to you about how we help solve some of those problems. And we also see lots and lots of complexity everywhere because you've got various different point solutions that you try and operate and deploy. And management obviously then becomes very important because it's not centralized, typically it's distributed, and crucially an awful lot of the tasks that most IT shops find themselves trying to manage on a day-to-day basis could, with the right platforms, be automated and made that little bit more efficient so that actually you can look to try and drive value-added work as an IT shop rather than just kind of getting stuck into the mundane day-to-day tasks. And of course, from optimizing that, the challenges that presents, being able to, or the inability to manage multiple applications from a with the same kind of efficiency that you'd have for a single app, or trying to shorten and back up and restore windows. So it's a complicated, complex situation that typically we're finding people struggling to look to try and manage and more importantly drive the best value from. Which is the reason why over the last 5 or 6 years as a company our growth has been pretty extreme, primarily off the back of virtualization initially with VMware. But even so, given the proliferation of virtualized environments around the industry at the moment, these are figures from May 2013 from a research analyst called King's Research. They're also echoed pretty nicely with what we see from IDC and Gartner in October-November time in 2013. But the fact that even though lots of people talk about virtualization, there are still lots of people that have only just started on the road or are only a point down the road rather than all the way there. Indeed, we're looking at over half of the market over the next 18 months or so still looking to complete that virtualization process. And interestingly, with Windows Server 2012 being on kind of general release now for about 18 months or so, again, you have over half, in this case, SMB customers looking to move into and migrate to Windows Server. What's relevant and interesting about this from a market share perspective is that in the past you'd have expected VMware, for instance, to account for typically 70 or 80% of that market share. IDC's latest figures back in November talk about Hyper-V's market share growing to over 33% of new virtualized server deployments. That's particularly relevant for this conversation because we do something truly unique at NetApp for our customers who are currently looking at either moving away from their traditional hypervisor provider, probably to Hyper-V for cost and futures in terms of future-proofing benefit. We provide the ability to migrate between hypervisors with our storage device in a way that means that you don't consume any additional storage, you don't need expensive swing kit, you start to eliminate expensive professional services within that, and we coined that, or we've named that whole process Shift. We have a project ongoing currently internally to productize that, and indeed Microsoft themselves have adopted that whole migration technology into their own migration automation toolkit. So as we continue through the presentation, we'll start to talk a little bit more about that in terms of how Microsoft support us and how we look to support you as customers in that whole process, and crucially look at some people that have done that as well. So some pointers, and I'm appreciative of the fact that for some of the guys in the audience, I'm probably teaching you to suck eggs a little bit, but why would you look at kind of pushing and driving that whole virtualization conversation today? Well, we've talked about some of the challenges around managing multiple applications and gaining the best possible efficiencies out of that, not just from a storage perspective, but also around your compute utilization. We have had for the last 4 years now a guarantee program at NetApp that essentially says that, quite simply, if you use NetApp as your storage device in your virtualized environment, you'll use 50% less storage with us than you will do from anybody else. there are obviously one or two T's and C's around that, but our best practices in terms of deployment guides aren't that stringent that that people don't have the ability to call us on it, and they never have. And it's a decent reflection on our ability to dedupe primary data, our ability to provision more storage than we actually have to enable greater efficiencies, to take multiple copies of data for instantaneous backup and recovery without consuming any additional space. It's these kind of efficiency technologies that mean that we're a very, very attractive proposition in all virtualized environments. But then when you apply that to our ability to migrate between hypervisors to help people adopt technologies that are becoming the norm as far as the market's concerned, and by that I mean Hyper-V, it becomes quite a strong proposition to look for us to take to our customers. But some definitions for you as we start to move the conversation on towards cloud. So NIST is an organization based in the States. It's the National Institute of Science and Technology. And NetApp, along with our core technology partners for private cloud in converged infrastructure, Microsoft and Cisco, all subscribe to the same framework in terms of our agreement and the way that we define cloud. What's interesting about it and what's relevant in terms of our conversation today is that these characteristics typically define virtualization as a common characteristic of cloud. There's quite a big misconception or perception that once you've virtualized an environment, be that server or storage, that you're well on the way to being or to adopting cloud-like capabilities of self-service and automation, all that kind of good stuff within your infrastructure. But actually, it's a common characteristic that's a building block of that. Some of the essential characteristics in terms of how you build a cloud framework are things like being able to pool resources and very rapidly and elastically reallocate resources or storage or compute. And crucially, the ability to self-serve that, so for the users to be able to request that kind of functionality is an essential characteristic rather than the common characteristic that things like virtualization and scale and software across the piece tend to look to adopt. If we look at how the industry is kind of transitioning through from a traditional basis of kind of application-based silos, and it's funny, I've been in this industry now for about 15 years, and 15 years ago we were talking about people with directly attached storage with a single application with some local storage behind a server, and actually that's just grown to a point where potentially we talk about silos of storage area networks, for instance, serving specific sets of applications. But the principle remains the same, is that actually we've kind of replaced one problem with another, which is how do you gain the best possible optimization in terms of your capacity, your utilization, and also the way that you pool resource across that if you're still looking to deploy your infrastructure in silos. So some of the transformations that we see moving through the industry right now, it started with virtualization and how you virtualize those applications and servers. And crucially then how you replicate that at the back end from a storage perspective. But in the last couple of years, especially with the drive initially to kind of public cloud type environments, we've seen that grow and change a little bit to a point where actually our value proposition from a storage perspective replicates the value proposition that Microsoft have come to market with over the last couple of years around System Center 2012 and Server 2012 in terms of virtualizing those zones of virtualization, private cloud and public cloud, and being able to provide to customers the ability to transition across all three. And that's reflected in something that we call Agile Data Infrastructure, which essentially is the ability to transition between either your virtualized zones on-premise or pushing out into cloud-based applications and service providers. And when you link those two together, and we'll talk about how in a second, you start to drive some pretty significant benefit. So we know, and we've talked about the fact that as our data centers change, as we look to try and drive greater efficiencies out of them, try and drive greater benefit out of existing investments by potentially looking at software deployments to make better use of what's already deployed. We know that it's a transitional phase, and for some customers, that might be anything from 4, 5, 6 years' time until they get to a point where they're kind of truly virtualized across there. But at the moment, we do start to provide the ability to build in some of those characteristics, to build in elasticity, and to start to introduce the concepts and crucially the opportunity to put some of the use case, if you like, in the hands of the users, so for self-service in particular. And as I say, whether that's to scale applications on the fly, whether that's to never need to take down your storage environment again for upgrade, or adding new capacity or compute, for instance, in some of the unified compute layers. We know it's a transition period, and we know that it takes a little bit of time, but crucially getting the building blocks in place now, using the characteristics that we've talked about, and deploying technologies from people like ourselves and Microsoft starts to give you the best possible start. So what does that look like from a product perspective? Well, as a NetApp presentation, it would be remiss of me not to try and include at least one reference to a box with some disks in it. So there we have it, right at the bottom of the slide, NetApp hardware, some, in this case, FAS devices running clustered data on tap, which is our storage operating system. Now, as we look through the stack on this slide, we look at the application layer at the top that all of this supports. Now, in this case, we're talking specifically about Microsoft, so obviously we're looking at Exchange and SharePoint and SQL. From a converged infrastructure perspective, our FlexPod platform with Cisco, we then look to build that out and include SAP and Oracle and Red Hat and so on and so forth. But for private cloud in particular, the real kind of secret sauce and the real key value in all of this is our integration of our storage OS with System Center 2012. And the fact that as far as API integration is concerned, and the PowerShell toolkit then that supports that for automation and orchestration of tasks, we're at a point now where we're simply unmatched in the industry. So let me qualify that and explain what I mean. So we are now API complete with System Center 2012. So what does that mean? As an admin, as a tool that you might wish to use System Center for, you can automate and orchestrate every single task that you would want to try and commit and use a NetApp filer for, whether that be something as simple as allocating additional capacity to a new LUN, or whether that be from a cold start deploying a 2,500 seat virtual machine environment from lights on inside 4 hours with a single line of PowerShell script. So the integration into that software platform for Microsoft Private Cloud is second to none. And actually, when we look at kind of the futures piece on that, it gets even more significant, because rather than restricting ourselves in terms of just integrating with a software platform, whether that be through Ops Manager or Orchestrator, and then you look to contrast how you can burst in and out of public cloud, we are, within the next 3 or 4 months, announcing support into Windows Azure as well. So all of a sudden, your ability to scale as a user from your private cloud environment using NetApp as the storage backend and Server 2012 and System Center as your kind of cloud management platform will be expanded even further by the ability to burst out into Azure seamlessly with NetApp at the back end of that. And who's doing this? So I'll talk through a couple of case studies for you now. There's a good one locally in the UK, which is Hymans Robertson, and we'll discuss those in a second. And then we'll talk about a larger customer, so ING Direct Bank. But Hymans is quite an interesting one, because actually some of the things that we've talked about already this morning in terms of their requirement to try and put public cloud-like capability in the hands of some of their users to enable IT to respond more quickly to user requirements was the #1 priority that they had as a business. But what they realized, and this is only 15 months or so ago, was that they needed to take a staged and stepped approach to building that, and we talked about that transitional process. So what Hymans had was a 5-year-old hardware infrastructure from a storage perspective that needed refreshing. They had a rather expensive, from their perspective, VMware estate for the virtualized environment that was coming up for renewal in, I think, June 2013. So they wanted to look at some way of migrating away from VMware onto Hyper-V. And once they'd done that, they wanted to deploy System Center for that whole self-service automation and orchestration element of kind of a private cloud deployment. So January 2013, they saw their first hardware install with NetApp. By the end of April, they transitioned their virtual machine environment over from VMware onto Hyper-V using Project Shift, which, as I mentioned earlier, is this unique migration capability from NetApp to move between hypervisors. And by October, they'd finished deploying System Center 2012 across their environment to essentially put in the hands of not just their users but their business some future-proofing. Their growth plans over the next 3 or 4 years are pretty significant, so what they wanted was an infrastructure that would allow them to very rapidly and elastically respond to the requirements of the business, whether that be with new applications or products that they were bringing to market. And in 9 months, they'd managed to go from a kind of cold start on that to a very, very efficient, easy to manage, automated and well orchestrated solution that ourselves, Microsoft and indeed Cisco, took a great deal of pleasure in working kind of side by side to drive as much benefit as we could do for the customer from. And Barry Smart, who's the IT director up at Hymans, is a pretty big advocate of this. It was his baby, if you like. It was his pet project. He'd been with the company about 18 months leading up into this, and what he wanted to do was try and affect some pretty significant change early on, and actually inside the 9 months that he's done that, they've seen significant benefits around the backup and recovery environment, some of the more traditional elements that you'd associate with NetApp, not just the whole drive towards private cloud. And ING Direct is another very, very strong case study for us, and incidentally for folks that are interested in pursuing additional conversation after this in terms of follow-up, you might even have opportunity on the go with Bytes or ourselves right now. Both of these people, Barry at Hymans and also Andrew Henderson, who I'll reference in a second, who's the CIO for ING Direct, are perfectly happy taking reference calls from our customers and prospects. This project specifically with ING has been very interesting in the sense that from Andrew's point of view, he's been promoted out of Australia into HQ in the Netherlands now, so it's had a pretty big impact on his career, and also the development of ING as an investment bank. Their challenge down in Australia was that as a relatively new provider in Oz, they were struggling to take as much market share as quickly as they'd like, purely because they couldn't bring products to market quickly enough. For their test and development environment, it would take anywhere up to about 10 weeks to provision a copy of the bank for the developers to actually use to test new applications and products on. What they wanted to do was conceptually kind of try and create a copy of the entire bank, if they could, and put it in a box, so that they could rapidly replicate that out to their developers with a view to trying to accelerate the application development time. Now, if you think about the initial issue that they had with that of 8 to 10 or in some cases 11 weeks in terms of being able to provision a copy of the bank, they were able to reduce those copies down to about 10 minutes. What was interesting is that in terms of the additional virtualization benefits that they saw behind that, they stripped out obviously a load of physical products that they just didn't require anymore from a compute perspective, but also in relation to the storage. They recognized immediate savings of about 4,000%. What does that mean in real terms? It meant that, quite simply, they were using significantly less of our kit than they were from our competitors who were replaced. And they were able to rapidly provision those copies of the bank almost immediately without consuming any additional capacity, so they didn't need the requirement for significant additional storage deployments off the back of that. Incidentally, there's a video case study, ING Direct, and we'll send some links out afterwards, but if you're stuck with something to do and you fancy a cup of coffee and watch the video after the presentation, if you have a look on YouTube or Bank in a Box with ING Direct, then you'll be able to watch the video case study at your leisure. So, in terms of how then you extrapolate that out to Microsoft environments in general, we've talked a little bit about the virtualization element of it and how we're helping drive uptake and adoption of Hyper-V, both for our customers and crucially for kind of supporting Microsoft around that. We've talked a little bit about how we start to drive more benefit from underutilized storage deployments as well as the server element of this. But for us, that's kind of only really scratching the surface. We have, along with our partner Cisco, a converged infrastructure stack called FlexPod, which essentially takes an awful lot of the guesswork out of the equation for our customers and our partners alike in terms of deploying best-of-breed technology to support their applications and their business needs. You know, FlexPod is a fully integrated and fully engineered converged infrastructure stack using Cisco Compute and networking and, in this case, NetApp FAS storage to rapidly increase the ability of somebody to deploy and drive greater efficiencies of their existing IT, in some cases where they already have one or two of those components deployed, but for new deployments, take away an awful lot of the risk of supporting new applications with new technology by virtue of the validated designs and workloads that we have behind that. And we touched on a little bit, sometimes what we, fairly disparagingly call our bread and butter abilities, but, we underestimate those at our cost. Over the middle of the 2000s, our growth before kind of virtualization became prime in the market was specific to applications, and our ability specifically around backup and recovery and optimizing those for applications like Exchange, SharePoint, and SQL is second to none in the industry. We have some very intelligent software applications that run across our storage devices that enable you to take those backups and crucially affect the restores in seconds, so almost instantaneously. They're very, very space efficient, so they don't consume very much capacity at all, whether that be in Exchange environments, for instance, starting to drive the speed of recovery and overall performance in Exchange. So our track history in and around the kind of the Microsoft workload is pretty impressive and important. There are interesting kind of add-ons that you can build into this. So, SharePoint seems to be continuing to become kind of the default collaboration tool in the market. And 5 or 6 years ago, people were looking at lots of expensive options with things like Documentum and equivalent products. And SharePoint, although was the fastest growing product in Microsoft's size to $1 billion, snuck up quite quietly on the rails before anybody really knew what was happening on it, and it's got to a point now where it's the dominant kind of collaboration tool. But it has significant challenges in terms of its scalability and crucially the ability to manage the content that's sat within it. We provide specific software plugins that enable you to either take content from other people's storage and enable that into SharePoint in a very, very space efficient manner, or indeed if SharePoint is running at almost kind of full capacity from a data perspective, we have, again, similar plugins that enable you to strip an awful lot of that content out to ease the management of it and drive greater benefit of that as a collaboration tool. So, we're not just talking about private cloud and virtualization. What we are talking about is kind of the full application stack from Microsoft. And just as we get to the point of kind of wrapping up the presentation this morning, I was in two minds as to whether or not I should start with kind of how we partner with Microsoft, but I figured it was probably worth talking to you about some of the facts and figures and savings and things that we can look to drive together by virtue of integrating this. But our relationship with Microsoft and how we partner with them isn't a new development. We have been working with them in some way, shape or form for probably about the last 16 or 17 years. Admittedly, it was a pretty rocky start because 17 years ago we were a fresh-faced startup that only did one thing really, which was file server consolidation. So you can appreciate that our friends in Reading didn't really like us too much because we were taking too many license files away from them. But that's evolved over the course of the last decade or so through the application era with our integration into things like Exchange and SharePoint that we've just touched on, into the virtualization era through our support of Hyper-V obviously, but crucially now into kind of cloud. And that growth of relationship is reflected in some of the awards that we've accrued from Microsoft over the last couple of years. So we are current Server Platform Partner of the Year for Microsoft. Interesting award for a storage vendor, but it's a reflection on that whole hypervisor adoption piece, not just in terms of the efficiencies that we bring in terms of supporting that application, but also the ability to move people between hypervisors and provide true flexibility for customers to drive greater benefit from. And last year we were named as Private Cloud Partner of the Year, which again reflects that kind of integration into System Center. And it's worth just dwelling on that for a second, because if you look at System Center in its kind of purest form, is a data center management tool. Well, how can you credibly manage a data center unless you are seamlessly integrated with the storage, the networking, the compute, and the application management of all of those things? We're the only storage vendor on the planet that's API complete with System Center. So we're the only vendor on the planet that can build a credible story around kind of data center integration with System Center by virtue of the development that we've done with Microsoft around that piece. And that's reflected in their awards for us, both in the server environment and in and around the private cloud. We've touched on some of the awards, so I can kind of scoot past those and just look to summarize. We know that the ability to drive great value and efficiency from a server and a storage perspective is one of our key value propositions to our customers and prospects together with Microsoft. You know, this isn't a new relationship or a new technology relationship that we're trying to establish. It's been built over the last, well, best part of 2 decades. And actually, when you look at how we drive benefit to our customers, both in terms of the way that we make data available to them and the way that we help drive productivity for their users, it really is a value proposition that's kind of unmatched in the industry. And to that extent, and one of the things to pick up on as a gold certified partner from an ISV perspective at NetApp with Microsoft is their appetite to collaborate with us in terms of hosting, educating and supporting customers and prospects alike. So we have some dates. I think that we are able to communicate this morning to you for a follow-up session at MTC with ourselves, Microsoft and Bytes, where we can start to get into some of the technical integration of kind of this value proposition in a bit more detail. Microsoft and NetApp, I think we've hosted over the course of the last 18 months more than 90 customers now out of Microsoft's Technology Center in Reading, and we continue to drive, especially around that converged stack, significant growth together. You know, 53% of NetApp's global revenues are aligned to some sort of Microsoft workload, and as I say, this is reflected on Microsoft's appetite to partner with us to look to try and deliver the greatest benefit that we possibly can for our customers and our prospects alike. So with that in mind, in terms of keeping your eyes open for the follow-on dates for our cafe briefing with Bytes, I'm going to hand back now to Matt, I think, for wrap-up. Thanks ever so much for your time this morning, everybody, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. So if anybody does have any questions, then obviously please do feel free to pop those in the questions box now, and we can then go through those for you. So we have had one question come through already. So is there a restriction on which hypervisor you are migrating using Project Shift, for example Citrix to Hyper-V?
So we've got some support as well in terms of a colleague of mine on the call, but I'll take it first because I think I'm right. At the moment, we migrate between VMware, Hyper-V, and Citrix. So those are the three main hypervisors that we provide that migration ability on. We are looking to obviously build in Oracle and others, but right now you've got kind of the three main players in the market that we have that ability to support your migrations with.
Okay, thank you very much. And if anybody's got any other questions, then please do pop those in the box now.
Getting away lightly.
No, so it looks like that's the only question. So yes, as we said before, if you would like more information on the event coming up, then obviously please do let us know. Thank you very much to Simon today for presenting for us, and thanks to Matt here at Bytes. And we hope that you join us on another webinar soon. So thank you very much.